Before we begin this incredible story from World War II, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more historical documentaries, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. The Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across the Italian peninsula in the autumn of 1943, illuminating a landscape forever changed by the tides of global conflict. The Allied invasion of Sicily had succeeded beyond expectations, and now British and American forces found themselves pushing northward through the boot of Italy, encountering resistance that would test their resolve and ingenuity in ways they had never anticipated. In the mountainous regions between Naples and Rome, where ancient olive groves met modern battlefields, a new kind of warfare was emerging. This was not the thunderous clash of tank battalions or the systematic bombing campaigns that had characterized much of the European theater. Instead, it was a subtle, psychological game of cat and mouse, where identity itself became a weapon and trust became the most precious commodity on the battlefield. The Italian campaign had begun with such promise. Following the successful landings in Sicily, Allied commanders had anticipated a swift advance up the peninsula, expecting Italian forces to crumble in the face of superior firepower and coordination. However, the reality proved far more complex. While the Italian government had indeed surrendered, German forces had quickly moved to fill the vacuum, establishing defensive lines that would prove remarkably resilient. More challenging still was the emergence of irregular warfare tactics that blurred the lines between combatant and civilian, friend and foe. In the chaos of a country torn between competing loyalties, where some Italians fought alongside the Germans while others aided the Allies, the battlefield became a maze of shifting allegiances and uncertain identities. It was in this environment that reports began filtering back to Allied intelligence officers of something unprecedented. Enemy operatives who spoke perfect English, wore authentic Allied uniforms, and carried proper identification documents. These were not simple spies or saboteurs, but sophisticated infiltrators who could pass casual inspection and move freely through Allied lines, gathering intelligence and creating havoc from within. The first incidents were dismissed as isolated cases of mistaken identity or nervous soldiers seeing threats where none existed. After all, the fog of war often created confusion, and in the heat of battle, friend and foe could sometimes become indistinguishable. However, as reports multiplied and patterns began to emerge, it became clear that something far more organized and dangerous was at work. Major Robert Harrison of the 45th Infantry Division was among the first to recognize the scope of the threat. A career military officer from Ohio, Harrison had served in North Africa and had developed a keen eye for irregularities in the field. When soldiers under his command began reporting encounters with suspicious individuals in Allied uniforms, he took these reports seriously, launching an investigation that would eventually uncover one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Italian campaign. The infiltrators were not random opportunists or desperate soldiers seeking to escape capture. They were highly trained operatives, carefully selected for their linguistic abilities and their capacity to adopt foreign mannerisms and customs. Their mission went far beyond simple reconnaissance. They were tasked with creating confusion, misdirecting Allied forces, and exploiting the very trust and camaraderie that held Allied units together. What made these operatives particularly dangerous was their attention to detail. They wore uniforms that had been aged and weathered to look authentic, carried personal items that told convincing backstories, and possessed an intimate knowledge of Allied procedures and protocols. Some had been recruited from Italian Americans who had been captured earlier in the war, while others were Italian nationals who had studied English extensively or had lived abroad before the conflict began. The psychological impact of these infiltrations cannot be overstated. In a combat environment where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death, soldiers suddenly found themselves questioning everyone around them. The comfortable assumption that anyone wearing an Allied uniform was automatically a friend became a potentially fatal misconception. As autumn deepened into winter, the infiltration campaign intensified. Allied supply lines, which stretched precariously across the mountainous Italian terrain, became increasingly vulnerable to sabotage and misdirection. Convoys found themselves following routes that led to ambushes, communication lines were compromised, and sensitive information began finding its way to German commanders with alarming frequency. The infiltrators operated with remarkable boldness, often approaching Allied checkpoints and installations with confidence, relying on their authentic appearance and prepared stories to gain access to restricted areas. They would engage in casual conversation with genuine Allied personnel, gathering information about troop movements, supply schedules, and operational plans that could prove invaluable to enemy forces. Perhaps most troubling was their ability to blend seamlessly into the social fabric of Allied units. During quiet moments between engagements, they would share meals with unsuspecting soldiers, participate in card games, and exchange stories from home. This social infiltration allowed them to gather intelligence that no amount of external surveillance could provide, gaining insights into morale, unit capabilities, and future operational plans. The success of these operations was facilitated by the chaos and confusion that naturally accompanied military operations in unfamiliar territory. Allied forces were constantly meeting new personnel as units were rotated, reinforced, or reassigned. In such an environment, a new face was rarely questioned, especially when that face came with proper documentation and a convincing story. As 1943 drew to a close, the infiltration campaign had reached a level of sophistication that threatened the very foundations of Allied operations in Italy. Something had to be done to identify and neutralize these operatives before they could inflict even greater damage on the Allied cause. The solution, when it came, would prove as ingenious as it was unexpected, highlighting the cultural differences that no amount of training could fully bridge. The winter of 1943-44 brought with it a new level of sophistication in the art of military deception. As Allied forces consolidated their positions along the Gustav Line, stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, they found themselves facing an enemy that had mastered not just the tactics of conventional warfare, but the subtle psychological elements that could turn the tide of entire campaigns. The infiltrators had refined their techniques to near perfection. Gone were the crude attempts at impersonation that had characterized earlier efforts. In their place was a system of such meticulous attention to detail that it bordered on the theatrical. Every aspect of an infiltrator's appearance and behavior was carefully crafted to withstand scrutiny, from the wear patterns on their boots to the specific slang expressions they used in casual conversation. Intelligence officers working for the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had established training facilities in occupied territories where selected operatives underwent intensive preparation for their missions. These facilities, often housed in requisitioned hotels or private estates, became schools for the art of cultural mimicry. Italian volunteers, motivated by various combinations of ideological conviction, financial incentives, and family pressures, submitted themselves to weeks of intensive instruction in American and British customs, military procedures, and linguistic nuances. The training regimen was comprehensive beyond anything previously attempted in intelligence operations. Operatives learned not just to speak English without detectable accents, but to adopt the regional variations that would make their cover stories believable. A supposed soldier from Brooklyn would speak differently from one claiming origins in rural Alabama, and these differences were drilled into the operatives until they became second nature. Physical preparation was equally thorough. Operatives were taught to walk with the characteristic gait of Allied soldiers, to hold their weapons in the prescribed manner, and to execute military courtesies with the precise timing and style expected in American and British units. Even their posture during rest periods was scrutinized and corrected, as experienced soldiers could often identify imposters simply by observing how they carried themselves when they thought no one was watching. The procurement of authentic uniforms and equipment represented perhaps the greatest triumph of this operation. Through a combination of battlefield scavenging, black market transactions, and carefully orchestrated captures, the infiltration teams assembled wardrobes that were virtually indistinguishable from genuine Allied equipment. Uniforms bore the correct manufacturer's labels, showed appropriate wear patterns, and even contained the small, personal modifications that soldiers typically made to improve comfort or functionality. Personal effects were crafted with equal care. Letters from fictional families were written on appropriate stationery and aged to look as though they had been carried for weeks. Photographs of supposed girlfriends and family members were carefully selected and treated to appear worn from handling. Even the contents of wallets were meticulously planned, with currency from the correct regions and small personal items that would support the operative's cover story. Documentation represented the greatest challenge, but also the most crucial element of successful infiltration. Military identification cards, unit assignment papers, and personal records had to be perfect to withstand even casual inspection. German intelligence had invested heavily in understanding Allied administrative procedures, and their forgery operations had reached a level of sophistication that produced documents virtually identical to genuine articles. The psychological preparation of the operatives was perhaps the most complex aspect of their training. Beyond learning facts and procedures, they had to internalize the mindset and emotional responses that would make their impersonation convincing under pressure. They studied American and British humor, learned to appreciate the cultural references that formed the basis of casual conversation among Allied soldiers, and developed the emotional reflexes that would allow them to respond naturally to unexpected situations. Mock scenarios were conducted regularly, where operatives would be placed in simulated Allied environments and required to maintain their cover while interacting with instructors playing the roles of suspicious military police or fellow soldiers. These exercises identified weaknesses in their preparation and provided opportunities to refine their techniques before deployment in actual operations. The operational deployment of these infiltrators followed carefully planned patterns designed to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing the risk of detection. They would typically be inserted into Allied rear areas during periods of high activity, when the movement of personnel was common and additional scrutiny was unlikely. Natural entry points included supply depots, casualty clearing stations, and temporary rest areas where the constant flow of personnel provided cover for newcomers. Once in position, the infiltrators operated according to predetermined mission parameters that balanced intelligence gathering with the need to maintain their cover. They were trained to be helpful, but not overly eager, social, but not suspiciously curious, and competent, but not remarkably skilled. The goal was to blend into the background of military life while systematically collecting information that could prove valuable to German commanders. Communication with their handlers required particular sophistication, as traditional methods of contact could easily expose the entire operation. Instead, they relied on dead drops, coded messages embedded in seemingly innocent communications, and carefully scheduled meetings disguised as routine military activities. The intelligence they gathered was compiled and transmitted through networks that often involved multiple intermediaries, making detection and interdiction extremely difficult. The impact of these operations on Allied morale and security was profound. Units found themselves operating under constant suspicion, never certain whether the soldier beside them was genuine or an enemy operative. This psychological pressure affected decision-making at all levels, as commanders found themselves second-guessing information sources and implementing additional security measures that slowed operational tempo and reduced efficiency. Perhaps most significantly, The infiltrators succeeded in creating an atmosphere of paranoia that threatened the unit cohesion upon which military effectiveness depended. Soldiers who had previously trusted each other implicitly now found themselves harboring doubts and suspicions. The informal networks of communication and support that had developed naturally within units began to break down as personnel became wary of sharing information or forming close relationships. As winter turned to spring in 1944, it became clear that the infiltration campaign had evolved from a tactical nuisance to a strategic threat. The time had come for Allied intelligence to develop countermeasures that could identify and neutralize these operatives before they could cause irreparable damage to the war effort. The solution, when it emerged, would demonstrate that even the most sophisticated deception could be undone by the simplest of cultural oversights. Spring arrived in Italy, with the promise of renewed military campaigns and the hope that Allied forces could finally break through the stubborn German defensive lines that had held them at bay through the long winter months. However, beneath the surface of conventional military preparations, a more subtle war continued to rage, one fought not with artillery and aircraft, but with words, mannerisms, and the countless small details that define cultural identity. The success of the Italian infiltrators had not gone unnoticed by Allied intelligence services, who recognized that they were facing an unprecedented challenge to operational security. Traditional counterintelligence methods designed to detect enemy agents operating in civilian environments proved inadequate when dealing with operatives who had successfully penetrated military units and were functioning as apparent soldiers. Colonel James Mackenzie, a career intelligence officer with extensive experience in European operations, was tasked with developing comprehensive countermeasures to address the infiltration threat. Mackenzie had served in various capacities throughout the Mediterranean theater and had developed a reputation for innovative approaches to complex security challenges. His background in anthropology, acquired during peacetime studies at Harvard University, proved unexpectedly valuable in analyzing the cultural dimensions of the infiltration problem. Mackenzie's initial assessment revealed the full scope of the challenge facing Allied forces. The infiltrators were not merely wearing enemy uniforms and carrying false papers. They had succeeded in adopting entire personas that could withstand casual scrutiny and even extended interaction with genuine Allied personnel. Their preparation had been so thorough that conventional interrogation techniques often failed to expose them, as they possessed detailed knowledge of American and British military procedures, geography, and popular culture. The key insight that would eventually lead to their detection came from Mackenzie's recognition that cultural identity extends far beyond language and customs to include unconscious patterns of behavior and preference that are established during childhood and remain largely unchanged throughout life. No matter how sophisticated their training, the infiltrators retained certain fundamental orientations that reflected their Italian origins and could potentially be exploited to reveal their true identities. Mackenzie assembled a team of specialists that included linguists, psychologists, and cultural anthropologists, along with Italian-American soldiers who could provide insights into the subtle differences between Italian and American worldviews. This interdisciplinary approach represented a revolutionary development in counterintelligence methodology, recognizing that successful detection of sophisticated operatives required understanding not just what they knew, but how they thought. The team began by conducting extensive interviews with captured infiltrators, seeking to identify patterns in their responses that might reveal their true backgrounds. These interviews, conducted under the guise of routine debriefings, focused not on military information, but on personal preferences, childhood memories, and emotional responses to various stimuli. The goal was to map the psychological terrain that the infiltrators could not successfully disguise, regardless of their training. One of the most significant discoveries was that the infiltrators, despite their extensive preparation, retained distinctly Italian approaches to social interaction and personal relationships. Their concepts of family loyalty, religious observance, and community obligation reflected values that were subtly but consistently different from those of typical American soldiers. While they could mimic American behavior, they could not entirely suppress the emotional frameworks that guided their responses to complex social situations. Food preferences emerged as a particularly revealing area of investigation. While the infiltrators had learned to express appreciation for standard American military rations and could discuss regional American cuisines with apparent knowledge, their unconscious reactions to various food combinations and preparation methods revealed patterns consistent with Italian rather than American upbringing. These reactions were often so subtle that the infiltrators themselves were unaware of them, making this line of inquiry particularly valuable. Religious and cultural observances provided another avenue for detection. The infiltrators had memorized facts about American religious practices and could discuss Protestant denominations with apparent familiarity, but their unconscious gestures and emotional responses during religious discussions often revealed Catholic backgrounds that were inconsistent with their claimed Protestant upbringings. Similarly, their reactions to discussions of American holidays and traditions sometimes reflected European rather than American cultural frameworks. Language patterns proved especially revealing when subjected to sophisticated analysis. While the infiltrators spoke English with convincing American or British accents, linguistic specialists discovered that their sentence structures and word choices sometimes reflected Italian grammatical patterns that had been unconsciously transferred to their English speech. These patterns were too subtle for casual detection, but became apparent when subjected to systematic analysis. The psychological profiling process revealed that many infiltrators retained distinctly European attitudes toward authority, hierarchy, and individual responsibility that differed from typical American perspectives. Their responses to scenarios involving moral dilemmas or ethical choices often reflected philosophical orientations that were more consistent with continental European thought than with American pragmatism and individualism. Regional knowledge proved another weakness in their preparation. While the infiltrators could discuss major American cities and landmarks with apparent familiarity, their knowledge of local customs, regional slang, and community traditions was often incomplete or inaccurate. When questioned about specific neighborhoods, local sports teams, or regional foods, they sometimes provided responses that revealed their information had been acquired through study rather than personal experience. Personal relationships and family dynamics provided additional opportunities for detection. The infiltrators had been trained to discuss American family structures and relationships, but their emotional responses to questions about family loyalty, parental authority, and sibling relationships sometimes revealed Mediterranean family patterns that differed from typical American experiences. These differences were often subtle, but became apparent to trained observers who understood the cultural variations. The team also discovered that the infiltrators retained Italian approaches to problem-solving and decision-making that could be detected through carefully designed scenarios. When presented with hypothetical situations requiring quick decisions, their responses sometimes reflected Italian cultural priorities and values rather than the American approaches they had been trained to emulate. These unconscious responses provided valuable clues to their true identities. Mackenzie's team developed a comprehensive assessment protocol that could be administered under the guise of routine military procedures, making it difficult for infiltrators to recognize that they were being tested. The protocol included seemingly casual conversations about personal backgrounds, preference questionnaires disguised as administrative requirements, and scenario-based discussions that appeared to be training exercises but were actually designed to reveal cultural orientations. The implementation of these detection methods required careful training of military police and intelligence personnel who would be responsible for conducting the assessments. The techniques had to be subtle enough to avoid alerting sophisticated operatives while being reliable enough to identify infiltrators with high confidence. This training program represented a significant investment in human resources, but proved essential for the success of the countermeasures. As spring advanced towards summer, the new detection methods began yielding results, identifying infiltrators who had successfully evaded previous security measures. However, the most dramatic breakthrough would come from an unexpected source, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective countermeasures are also the simplest, arising from fundamental cultural differences that no amount of training can fully overcome. The breakthrough in detecting Italian infiltrators came not from sophisticated psychological analysis or complex linguistic testing, but from the most basic of human experiences, food preferences and the cultural memories they evoke. It was a discovery that would revolutionize counterintelligence procedures and demonstrate how deeply cultural identity is embedded in the unconscious patterns of daily life. Sergeant Anthony Castellano, of the Military Police Corps, had grown up in Boston's North End, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and aromas of Italian-American community life. His grandparents had emigrated from Naples in the early 1900s, bringing with them not just their language and traditions, but the deeply ingrained food customs that would define family life for generations. When Castellano enlisted in 1942, he carried with him not just his service commitment, but an intimate knowledge of Italian culinary culture that would prove invaluable in ways no one could have anticipated. The revelation came during what appeared to be a routine checkpoint inspection near Anzio in late spring of 1944. Allied forces were consolidating their positions following the successful but costly amphibious landings, and security procedures had been intensified in response to increased infiltration attempts. Castellano was conducting standard identity verifications when he encountered a soldier whose papers identified him as Private Michael Romano from Philadelphia. Romano's documentation was impeccable, his uniform authentic, and his English fluent with what appeared to be a genuine Philadelphia accent. He carried letters from family members written on appropriate stationery and aged to suggest long handling. His military knowledge was comprehensive, and he displayed familiarity with American customs and popular culture that would have satisfied most security screenings. By all conventional measures, he appeared to be exactly what his papers claimed. However, something about Romano's demeanor triggered Castellano's instincts. Perhaps it was the way he held himself, or the slight hesitation in his responses to certain questions, but Castellano found himself conducting a more thorough examination than usual. As the conversation continued, Castellano noticed that Romano claimed Italian-American heritage, specifically mentioning that his grandparents had come from the same region of Italy as Castellano's own family. This apparent connection led Castellano to engage in the kind of casual conversation that often develops between soldiers who discover shared backgrounds. They discussed the Italian-American neighborhoods they claimed to know, the family traditions they supposedly shared, and the foods that had defined their childhood experiences. Throughout this conversation, Romano responded appropriately, demonstrating knowledge of Italian-American culture that supported his claimed identity. The decisive moment came when Castellano, almost without thinking, asked Romano how his family prepared spaghetti. It was the kind of innocent question that might arise naturally in a conversation between two Italian Americans comparing childhood memories. Romano's response seemed appropriate at first. He described a traditional tomato sauce with garlic and herbs, mentioning ingredients and preparation methods that were consistent with Italian-American cooking traditions. However, Castellano noticed something crucial in Romano's description. When discussing how the spaghetti was prepared, Romano mentioned breaking the pasta before cooking it to make it easier to eat. To most observers, this would have seemed like an insignificant detail, perhaps even a reasonable practical consideration. But to someone who had grown up in an authentic Italian-American household, it was a cultural impossibility that revealed Romano's true identity. In traditional Italian cooking, breaking spaghetti before cooking is considered not just inappropriate, but almost sacrilegious. Long pasta is meant to be cooked whole and eaten by twirling it around a fork, a technique that Italian children learn from an early age. Breaking pasta before cooking suggests either ignorance of proper Italian techniques or an attempt to adapt Italian cooking to non-Italian eating habits. No Italian mother or grandmother would teach a child to break spaghetti, and no person raised in an authentic Italian household would consider it acceptable. This cultural misstep revealed that Romano, despite his extensive training and convincing documentation, had learned about Italian-American food culture through observation and study rather than personal experience. His knowledge was comprehensive but academic, lacking the unconscious certainties that come from childhood immersion in authentic cultural practices. The error was subtle enough that most observers would have missed it, but to someone with genuine Italian-American heritage, it was a clear indication of false identity. Castellano's suspicions aroused, he continued the conversation while discreetly signaling for additional security personnel. He asked Romano about other aspects of Italian-American family life, focusing on food-related customs and traditions. Romano's responses continued to reveal small but significant errors in cultural understanding. He mentioned eating practices, holiday food traditions, and family cooking customs that were plausible but not quite authentic, reflecting the kind of knowledge that comes from external observation rather than lived experience. The interrogation that followed revealed that Romano was indeed an Italian operative who had undergone extensive training in Allied customs and procedures. His preparation had been thorough in most respects, but the infiltration program had failed to account for the subtle but crucial differences between Italian and Italian-American food cultures. The assumption had been that Italian operatives, being familiar with Italian cuisine, could easily impersonate Italian Americans discussing food traditions. This assumption proved fatally flawed because it failed to recognize that Italian-American food culture had evolved along unique lines during decades of adaptation to American ingredients, cooking methods, and eating habits. While maintaining Italian foundations, Italian-American cuisine had developed distinctive characteristics that differentiated it from both traditional Italian cooking and general American food culture. These differences were subtle enough to escape casual notice, but significant enough to expose operatives who had learned their cover stories through study rather than experience. The success of this detection method led to immediate changes in security procedures throughout Allied forces in Italy. Military police and intelligence personnel were briefed on the techniques that had proven successful, and soldiers with appropriate cultural backgrounds were assigned to assist in identity verification procedures. The focus on food culture proved particularly valuable because it represented an area of knowledge that was difficult to acquire through formal training and that revealed unconscious cultural orientations. Additional food-based detection methods were quickly developed and implemented. Italian-American personnel were consulted to identify other cultural practices and preferences that could serve as reliable indicators of authentic heritage. These included not just cooking methods, but eating customs, family food traditions, and regional variations within Italian-American communities that would be difficult for outsiders to master completely. The revelation that cultural identity could be most reliably detected through seemingly insignificant details of daily life led to a broader reconceptualization of counterintelligence methods. Rather than focusing primarily on documentation and formal knowledge, security procedures began incorporating assessments of unconscious cultural patterns that were much more difficult to falsify convincingly. The impact on the infiltration program was immediate and devastating. As news of the detection breakthrough spread through intelligence networks, enemy operatives found their mission parameters fundamentally compromised. The simple question about pasta preparation had exposed a vulnerability that threatened the entire sophisticated apparatus that had been constructed to support the infiltration campaign. The discovery of the spaghetti test, as it came to be known among Allied intelligence personnel, marked the beginning of a systematic unraveling of the infiltration network that had operated so successfully throughout the Italian campaign. What had begun as a single astute observation by Sergeant Castellano rapidly evolved into a comprehensive counterintelligence operation that would expose the full scope of enemy infiltration activities and neutralize one of the most sophisticated deception campaigns of the war. Colonel Mackenzie recognized immediately that the cultural detection method represented a breakthrough that could be applied systematically across Allied forces in Italy. Within days of Romano's exposure, Mackenzie had assembled a team of Italian-American personnel from various units to develop a comprehensive catalogue of cultural indicators that could reliably distinguish authentic Italian-Americans from trained operatives attempting to assume false identities. The team, working under conditions of absolute secrecy to prevent enemy intelligence from developing countermeasures, began documenting the subtle cultural differences that had proven so revealing in Romano's case. They discovered that food preparation was just one area where authentic cultural knowledge differed from what could be learned through external observation and study. Regional variations within Italian-American communities, family traditions that had evolved uniquely in American contexts, and cultural adaptations that reflected the specific experiences of immigrant communities all provided opportunities for detection. Sergeant Castellano was immediately reassigned to special duties, working directly with Colonel Mackenzie's team to train other personnel in the application of cultural detection methods. His natural instincts, honed by genuine cultural experience, proved invaluable in developing techniques that could be taught to personnel who lacked his specific background. The training program focused not just on specific cultural knowledge, but on developing the kind of intuitive awareness that had enabled Castellano to recognize something wrong in Romano's responses. The implementation of the new detection methods required careful coordination to maintain operational security while maximizing effectiveness. Military police units throughout the theater were quietly briefed on the techniques, with special emphasis on maintaining the appearance of routine security procedures. The goal was to identify and apprehend infiltrators without alerting the broader network to the fact that their methods had been compromised. The results exceeded all expectations. Within weeks of implementing the cultural detection protocols, Allied forces had identified and apprehended dozens of infiltrators who had previously operated undetected within their ranks. Each arrest provided additional intelligence about the structure and methods of the infiltration network, enabling security personnel to refine their techniques and expand their understanding of enemy operations. The interrogations of captured operatives revealed the extraordinary sophistication of the infiltration program. The training facilities, operational procedures, and support networks that had been established to sustain the deception campaign represented a significant investment of resources and personnel. German intelligence had recognized the potential value of penetrating Allied units and had committed substantial assets to making the program successful. The operatives themselves proved to be a diverse group, recruited through various means and motivated by different factors. Some were Italian nationals who had been convinced to support German efforts through ideological appeals or financial incentives. Others were prisoners of war who had been offered improved conditions in exchange for cooperation. A few were genuine volunteers who believed they were serving Italian interests by working with German intelligence. The sophistication of their training was remarkable in its comprehensiveness. Beyond language instruction and cultural orientation, the operatives had received extensive military training that enabled them to function effectively within Allied units. They understood weapon systems, communication procedures, and tactical concepts well enough to participate meaningfully in military operations while gathering intelligence and identifying opportunities for sabotage. The support network that sustained these operations included safe houses, communication systems, and extraction procedures that had been carefully established throughout occupied Italy. German intelligence had invested considerable effort in creating the infrastructure necessary to deploy, supply, and recover operatives working behind Allied lines. The discovery of this network provided valuable insights into German intelligence capabilities and methodologies. The psychological impact of the exposures extended far beyond the immediate security improvements achieved through removing infiltrators from Allied ranks. The knowledge that sophisticated enemy operatives had been successfully identified and neutralized helped restore confidence among Allied personnel who had been operating under constant suspicion and uncertainty. The restoration of trust within military units proved crucial for maintaining the cohesion and effectiveness upon which successful operations depended. However, the counterintelligence successes also revealed the vulnerability of Allied forces to sophisticated deception operations. The infiltrators had succeeded in penetrating security measures and operating undetected for extended periods, gathering intelligence that had undoubtedly compromised Allied plans and operations. The extent of the damage would never be fully known, but the potential implications were sobering for military planners and intelligence professionals. The broader implications of the cultural detection breakthrough extended beyond the immediate tactical situation in Italy. Military planners recognized that similar techniques might be employed in other theaters of operation, and efforts were immediately undertaken to develop appropriate countermeasures for different cultural and linguistic contexts. The success of the Italian operation demonstrated both the potential effectiveness of sophisticated infiltration campaigns and the possibilities for defeating them through innovative counterintelligence methods. The intelligence gathered through the interrogation of captured operatives provided valuable insights into German intelligence priorities and methods that would prove useful in other contexts throughout the war. Understanding how the infiltration program had been organized and implemented helped Allied intelligence professionals anticipate and counter similar efforts in other theaters of operation. As summer advanced toward autumn in 1944, the infiltration threat in Italy had been largely neutralized through the application of cultural detection methods and the systematic dismantling of the supporting network. The sophisticated deception campaign that had posed such a significant threat to Allied operations had been defeated not through technological superiority or overwhelming force, but through the recognition that cultural identity runs deeper than language or customs and cannot be perfectly replicated through training and study. The success of the counterintelligence operation represented a triumph of innovation and cultural understanding over sophisticated deception and careful preparation. It demonstrated that even the most elaborate schemes could be undone by simple truths about human nature and cultural identity, proving that authenticity, however subtle, could not be perfectly counterfeited by those who lacked genuine experience. The systematic exposure of the Italian infiltration network during the summer of 1944 provided Allied intelligence services with unprecedented insights into the nature of cultural identity and the limitations of even the most sophisticated deception operations. The lessons learned from this campaign would influence counterintelligence methodology for decades to come, establishing new standards for identity verification that recognize the deep cultural foundations of personal authenticity. The success of the cultural detection methods led to intensive study of the psychological and anthropological principles that had made them so effective. Research teams, composed of military intelligence personnel, academic specialists, and cultural experts, began systematic analysis of the factors that contributed to the infiltrators' exposure, seeking to understand why authentic cultural identity proved so difficult to replicate convincingly. Dr. Margaret Wilson, an anthropologist from Columbia University who had been commissioned as a major in the Women's Army Corps, led much of this research effort. Her peacetime studies of immigrant communities had provided her with unique insights into the processes by which cultural identity was formed and maintained across generations. Her wartime assignment to study the infiltration phenomenon represented a pioneering application of anthropological methods to military intelligence problems. Wilson's research revealed that cultural identity operated on multiple levels, from conscious knowledge and deliberate behavior to unconscious assumptions and automatic responses. The infiltrators had succeeded in mastering the conscious and deliberate aspects of American and British identity, learning facts, customs, and behavioral patterns that enabled them to pass superficial scrutiny. However, they had been unable to replicate the unconscious cultural programming that shaped responses to unexpected situations and revealed authentic identity under pressure. The food culture discovery had exposed a fundamental principle. Authentic cultural identity was acquired through childhood immersion in specific cultural contexts, creating neural pathways and emotional associations that could not be replicated through adult learning, regardless of the sophistication of the training program. The unconscious certainties about proper food preparation that had revealed Romano's deception were representative of thousands of similar cultural markers that distinguished authentic identity from learned performance. Language analysis provided additional confirmation of these principles. While the infiltrators had achieved remarkable fluency in English, linguistic specialists discovered that their speech patterns retained subtle markers of their native language background that became apparent under stress or in spontaneous conversation. These markers were not accent-related, which had been largely eliminated through training, but involved deeper structural patterns that reflected the grammatical logic of their first language. The research also revealed that cultural identity involved not just knowledge of customs and traditions, but emotional responses to cultural symbols and concepts that reflected deep psychological associations formed during early development. The infiltrators could discuss American holidays, regional customs, and family traditions with apparent knowledge and enthusiasm, but their emotional responses to these discussions sometimes revealed that their knowledge was intellectual rather than experiential. Regional and community-specific knowledge proved particularly revealing. While the infiltrators had studied American culture extensively, their knowledge tended to be general rather than locally specific. When questioned about neighborhood landmarks, local customs, or community personalities from the areas they claimed as home, their responses often revealed the limitations of knowledge acquired through formal study rather than personal experience. The family dynamics and relationship patterns that the infiltrators described when discussing their supposed backgrounds sometimes reflected European rather than American social structures. Their concepts of family authority, sibling relationships, and community obligations revealed cultural orientations that were subtly but consistently different from typical American patterns, providing trained observers with reliable indicators of deception. Religious and spiritual practices provided another area where authentic identity differed from learned performance. While the infiltrators could discuss Protestant denominations and American religious customs with apparent familiarity, their unconscious gestures, emotional responses, and fundamental assumptions about spiritual matters often reflected Catholic backgrounds that were inconsistent with their claimed Protestant upbringings. The economic and social assumptions that guided the infiltrators' responses to hypothetical situations revealed different cultural priorities and values than those typical of American soldiers. Their approaches to problem-solving, concepts of individual responsibility, and attitudes toward authority reflected European social structures and philosophical orientations that differed from American individualistic patterns. The breakthrough had immediate practical applications beyond the specific context of the Italian campaign. Training programs were rapidly developed for intelligence personnel in other theaters of operation, focusing on cultural detection methods appropriate for different linguistic and cultural contexts. The principles discovered through the Italian experience proved applicable to other deception scenarios, though the specific cultural markers varied according to local circumstances. The success of the cultural detection approach also led to improvements in Allied personnel security procedures. Rather than relying primarily on documentation and formal credentials, security systems began incorporating assessments of cultural authenticity that were much more difficult to falsify. These procedures proved particularly valuable in contexts where sophisticated enemy intelligence services might attempt similar infiltration operations. The psychological impact of the counterintelligence success extended beyond immediate security improvements to include broader effects on military morale and unit cohesion. The knowledge that reliable methods existed for detecting enemy infiltrators helped restore confidence among Allied personnel and eliminated much of the suspicion and paranoia that had developed during the height of the infiltration campaign. The intelligence gathered through the systematic exposure of the network provided valuable insights into German intelligence capabilities and priorities that influenced Allied planning in other contexts. Understanding the resources and methods that had been committed to the infiltration program helped military planners assess enemy capabilities and anticipate potential threats in other theaters of operation. The diplomatic implications were also significant. The exposure of the infiltration network provided concrete evidence of German intelligence operations that violated established conventions governing the treatment of prisoners of war and the conduct of military operations. This evidence proved useful in post-war accountability proceedings and contributed to the development of international legal frameworks governing intelligence activities. As autumn advanced toward winter, the lessons learned from the infiltration crisis had been systematically incorporated into Allied intelligence procedures and training programs. The cultural detection methods that had proven so successful were being adapted for use in other contexts, and the principles they embodied were influencing broader approaches to identity verification and security assessment. The experience had demonstrated that cultural identity represented one of the most reliable and difficult to falsify aspects of personal authenticity. No matter how sophisticated the training or how comprehensive the preparation, authentic cultural identity involved unconscious patterns and automatic responses that reflected genuine life experience and could not be perfectly replicated through study and practice. As 1944 drew to a close and Allied forces prepared for the final push toward Germany, the infiltration crisis that had once threatened the security of the entire Italian campaign had been transformed from a source of vulnerability into a demonstration of Allied adaptability and innovation. The systematic dismantling of the network had not only neutralized an immediate threat, but had also established new standards for counterintelligence operations that would influence security practices for generations to come. The comprehensive debriefing of captured operatives had provided Allied intelligence with a detailed understanding of German espionage capabilities and methodologies that proved invaluable in other contexts throughout the war. The sophistication of the infiltration program revealed the extent to which enemy intelligence services had evolved their techniques adapting traditional espionage methods to the unique challenges of modern warfare and exploiting the cultural diversity of Allied forces as an opportunity for penetration. Colonel Mackenzie's final report on the infiltration crisis, classified at the highest levels and distributed only to senior commanders and intelligence officials, documented not only the successful resolution of the immediate threat, but also the broader implications for military security in an increasingly interconnected world. The report emphasized that cultural diversity, while representing one of the greatest strengths of Allied forces, also created vulnerabilities that required sophisticated countermeasures to address effectively. The Italian-American personnel who had played such crucial roles in developing and implementing the cultural detection methods received appropriate recognition for their contributions, though much of their work remained classified for decades after the war ended. Sergeant Castellano, whose intuitive recognition of cultural deception had initiated the breakthrough, was awarded the Bronze Star for his contributions to Allied security, though the specific nature of his achievement could not be publicly acknowledged at the time. The training programs developed during the crisis were systematically expanded and adapted for use in other theaters of operation where similar threats might emerge. Military intelligence schools incorporated courses on cultural detection methods into their curricula, recognizing that future conflicts would likely involve similar attempts to exploit cultural diversity and social complexity for espionage purposes. The success of the cultural approach to counterintelligence also influenced post-war intelligence organizations, contributing to the development of more sophisticated methods for identity verification and background investigation. The recognition that cultural identity operated on multiple levels, from conscious knowledge to unconscious behavioral patterns, became a fundamental principle in personnel security procedures. The academic study of the infiltration phenomenon continued after the war ended, as researchers sought to understand the broader implications of the discovery that cultural identity could serve as a reliable indicator of authenticity. Dr. Wilson's work became foundational to the emerging field of applied anthropology, demonstrating how academic disciplines could contribute directly to practical problem-solving in military and intelligence contexts. The diplomatic and legal implications of the infiltration campaign also continued to evolve after the war. The documentation of German intelligence operations provided evidence for war crimes tribunals and contributed to the development of international legal frameworks governing espionage activities. The systematic nature of the deception operations raised questions about the boundaries between legitimate intelligence gathering and illegal activities under international law. The psychological impact on the participants, both Allied personnel and captured infiltrators, became a subject of ongoing study as researchers sought to understand the long-term effects of prolonged deception operations on mental health and personal identity. The infiltrators, having lived under false identities for extended periods, often experienced significant difficulties readjusting to their authentic selves after capture, highlighting the psychological costs of sophisticated deception operations. The technological implications were equally significant. The success of human-based cultural detection methods influenced the development of more sophisticated identity verification technologies, leading to research into biometric identification, psychological profiling, and other technical approaches to authenticity assessment. The recognition that cultural identity involved unconscious patterns that were difficult to falsify contributed to ongoing research into the relationship between technology and human identity verification. The historical record of the infiltration crisis, once declassified, became an important case study in military history, intelligence studies, and anthropological research. Universities incorporated the Italian experience into curricula dealing with cultural conflict, intelligence operations, and the practical applications of social science research to real-world problems. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate context of World War II to influence Cold War intelligence operations and contemporary security challenges. The principles discovered through the Italian experience proved relevant to other contexts where cultural identity and authenticity became important factors in security assessment and threat detection. The humanitarian aspects of the story also deserve recognition. The systematic exposure of the infiltration network ultimately saved lives on both sides by ending operations that had prolonged combat and increased casualties through the dissemination of false intelligence and misdirection of military operations. The restoration of trust within Allied units improved coordination and effectiveness, contributing to faster resolution of military objectives with reduced human costs. The educational legacy continues to this day, as the infiltration crisis provides valuable lessons about the relationship between cultural identity and security in an increasingly globalized world. Modern security challenges involving identity verification, cultural authenticity, and the detection of sophisticated deception operations continue to benefit from the insights developed during that crucial period in 1944. The story ultimately demonstrates that even the most sophisticated deception operations contain inherent limitations based on the authentic nature of human cultural identity. No matter how comprehensive the training or how careful the preparation, there remain aspects of authentic cultural experience that cannot be perfectly replicated by those who lack genuine immersion in specific cultural contexts. The Italian infiltrators, despite their remarkable preparation and undeniable courage in undertaking such dangerous missions, were ultimately defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by the simple truth that cultural identity runs deeper than language, customs, or even extensive training can reach. The unconscious patterns of thought, emotional response, and behavioral preference that define authentic cultural experience proved impossible to falsify completely, providing Allied forces with the tools they needed to detect and neutralize the threat. The legacy of their exposure serves as a reminder that authenticity, however subtle, possesses qualities that distinguish it from even the most sophisticated imitation, and that human cultural identity represents one of the most reliable foundations for distinguishing truth from deception in a world where appearances can be carefully crafted to mislead. Epilogue. Echoes across time. In the years that followed the end of World War II, as the details of the Italian infiltration crisis gradually became declassified and available to historians and researchers, the story evolved from a wartime intelligence operation into a broader meditation on the nature of identity, authenticity, and cultural belonging in an increasingly interconnected world. The simple question about spaghetti preparation that had exposed the deception became symbolic of something much larger, the recognition that cultural identity operates on levels so fundamental that they resist conscious manipulation or artificial replication. Veterans of the Italian campaign, when they eventually learned the full details of the operation, often expressed amazement that something so seemingly insignificant could have such profound implications for military security and operational effectiveness. Sergeant Anthony Castellano, whose cultural instincts had initiated the breakthrough, returned to Boston after the war and resumed his civilian life, eventually becoming a successful restaurant owner in the North End neighborhood where he had grown up. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, but those who knew him understood that he had played a crucial role in one of the most innovative counterintelligence operations of the conflict. His restaurant became an informal gathering place for Italian-American veterans, where conversations often touched on themes of identity, belonging, and the subtle markers that distinguish authentic cultural experience from learned imitation. Colonel James Mackenzie continued his intelligence career after the war, eventually rising to senior positions within the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where his experience with cultural detection methods influenced the development of personnel security procedures and identity verification protocols. His academic background in anthropology, which had proven so valuable during the Italian crisis, helped establish interdisciplinary approaches to intelligence analysis that recognized the importance of cultural understanding in modern security challenges. Dr. Margaret Wilson's wartime research became the foundation for a distinguished post-war academic career focused on the practical applications of anthropological methods to contemporary social problems. Her work influenced generations of social scientists and intelligence professionals, demonstrating how academic disciplines could contribute directly to solving real-world challenges. Her published studies of the infiltration phenomenon became classic texts in the emerging fields of applied anthropology and cultural security studies. The infiltrators themselves, those who survived the war and were eventually repatriated, faced the complex challenge of readjusting to their authentic identities after months or years of living under carefully constructed false personas. Many experienced significant psychological difficulties as they attempted to reconnect with their genuine cultural roots and personal relationships. Their experiences provided valuable insights into the psychological costs of prolonged deception and the importance of authentic cultural identity for mental health and personal stability. The training facilities and support networks that had sustained the infiltration operation were systematically dismantled by Allied forces as they advanced through occupied territory. The careful documentation of these facilities provided intelligence services with detailed understanding of German capabilities and methodologies that proved valuable in post-war security planning and international intelligence cooperation. The broader implications of the cultural detection breakthrough continued to influence security practices throughout the Cold War era and beyond. The recognition that authentic cultural identity possessed characteristics that were extremely difficult to falsify became a fundamental principle in intelligence and security operations, leading to the development of increasingly sophisticated methods for identity verification and authenticity assessment. Modern applications of these principles can be seen in contemporary security challenges involving identity fraud, terrorist infiltration, and cybersecurity threats, where cultural authenticity remains an important factor in distinguishing legitimate from fraudulent actors. The basic insight that cultural identity operates on multiple levels, from conscious knowledge to unconscious patterns, continues to inform security procedures and threat assessment methodologies. The story also serves as a reminder of the importance of cultural diversity within security organizations. The success of the cultural detection methods depended largely on the insights and instincts of personnel who possessed authentic cultural knowledge that could not be acquired through formal training. This lesson continues to influence recruitment and personnel policies in intelligence and security organizations, emphasizing the value of cultural diversity as both an operational asset and a security necessity. Educational institutions continue to study the infiltration crisis as an example of how interdisciplinary approaches to complex problems can yield innovative solutions that might not emerge from traditional methodologies. The collaboration between military intelligence personnel, academic researchers, and culturally knowledgeable practitioners established models for problem-solving that remain relevant to contemporary challenges requiring similar interdisciplinary cooperation. The humanitarian dimensions of the story also deserve continued recognition. The exposure of the infiltration network ultimately contributed to saving lives and reducing the duration of combat operations by restoring trust and effectiveness within Allied military units. The broader principle that security measures should serve human welfare rather than merely protecting institutional interests remains relevant to contemporary discussions of the balance between security and human rights. As we reflect on this remarkable episode from the annals of military history, we are reminded that even in the midst of global conflict and sophisticated deception operations, fundamental human truths about identity, authenticity, and cultural belonging ultimately prevail. The story of the Italian infiltrators and their exposure demonstrates that while technology and training can achieve remarkable results in creating artificial identities, there remain aspects of authentic human experience that resist perfect replication. The legacy continues to influence how we think about identity and authenticity in an age where digital manipulation and sophisticated deception have become increasingly common. The basic principle that authentic cultural identity possesses characteristics that distinguish it from learned imitation remains as relevant today as it was on that spring day in 1944, when Sergeant Castellano asked a simple question about pasta preparation and changed the course of intelligence history. The echoes of that question continue to resonate across time, reminding us that sometimes the most profound truths are revealed through the simplest inquiries, and that authentic cultural identity represents one of the most reliable foundations for distinguishing truth from deception in a world where appearances can be carefully crafted to mislead. The story stands as a testament to the power of cultural understanding, human intuition, and the enduring importance of authenticity in all its forms. Thank you for watching this documentary about one of World War II's most fascinating intelligence operations. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel for more historical documentaries, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories from history to light, ensuring that the lessons and sacrifices of previous generations are not forgotten.